The final movie on conditional formatting involving formulas. We're going to go over the rules that you need to keep in mind when you're trying to generate conditional formatting using formulas. We'll take a look at absolute references and relative references, and I'll show you a couple of examples where we can format every other row, and we can format rows or cells based on their content. So this is conditional formatting based on formulas. There's a couple of rules or a couple of things you need to keep in mind when you're doing this. First off, you can refer to other cells on other worksheets when you're building your formulas. Secondly, and this might be the most important rule, is that the formula must evaluate to either true or 1 or false or 0. Because if you think about it, what you want is for Excel to determine whether the condition applies or not. You're not trying to build a formula to generate a numeric result, 17 for instance. You're trying to have Excel determine whether to apply a certain formatting to that cell or not, and you either are going to do it or you're not, so the formula has to generate a result that causes Excel to apply the formatting or not apply the formatting. The next 4 rules we're going to be covering as we're going through these examples, but Excel's default is to make the references absolute when you're building your formulas. Sometimes that's not what you want. You have to be careful about using navigation keys when you're trying to build your formulas in the dialog box. When you're building a formula in a range, you have to be careful about which cell is the active cell, because that's the cell that you want to build your formula for, and it'll apply to every cell in the range. And while you're working in the dialog box, it's good to keep in mind that there are 3 modes: enter, point, and edit. And if Excel goes to the point mode, you can get back to the edit mode by pressing F2. So conditional formatting using formulas. I'm going to first select the area or the region that I want to conditionally format, and I want to format these dates if they match the date that's in B11. So I have a situation where I probably need a mixture of absolute and relative references, and I'll show you what I mean by that. We're going to go to the Styles group, left-click Conditional Formatting, left-click New Rules, and then left-click Use a Formula to determine which cells to format. Now, as I mentioned in rule number 5, you have to keep in mind the active cell for this range that I've selected. The active cell is in the name box, it's C11, so when I build this formula that applies to all of the cells that are selected, we do it while keeping in mind that this formula should be applicable for cell C11. So how do we do this? I'm going to left-click in the format cells where this formula is true. The cursor is blinking, Excel's waiting for me to do something. I can left-click on that reference, and as I said, in rule number 3, when you point to a cell and you're building your formulas, Excel's default is to make the reference an absolute reference. In this case, that's what I want. And I want this formula to evaluate to true if the date in cell B11 equals the date in cell C11. And I don't want this reference, C11, to be an absolute reference. I want it to be a relative reference because I want it to apply to all the cells in this range. From here, I can just set some formatting, and I'll just do some simple formatting just so we can see that, in fact, our formula is actually working. Left-click OK, and left-clicking off of that. And this works because all of the dates that are in cells C11 to C30 are being compared against the date that's in B11, that's the absolute reference. And if they equal one another, we get our conditional formatting applied. We can also build a relative reference, and I'm going to first select the area or the region that I want to apply the conditional formatting to. Left-click Conditional Formatting, left-click New Rule, and left-click Use a Formula to determine which cells to format. Now what I want is a relative reference. So I'll first click in the field where I'm going to build my formula, and you have the option to type all of this out. As long as you begin with an equal sign, so Excel knows it's a formula and not a text string, you can actually type this all out. But I'm going to choose to point to the cell reference that I want to begin my formula with. And once again, Excel has made that an absolute reference. I can press F4 3 times to make it a relative reference. And I want to test whether that value is greater than 3. And if it is, I want the fill to be green. And I want it to apply to all the cells in my range. And we get the result we were after. This cell is actually referring to this cell, and that's not greater than 3, it's equal to 3. This cell is referring to this cell, and of course 1 is less than 3, and so on. I'm going to do that again and clear the conditional formatting from this region and build another rule with a formula. Only this time I want to try to use the arrow keys to reference the cell. And I can do that to an extent. I'm arrowing up, making that a relative reference, and then I'm going to say equals to whatever value I put there, and I want that to be an absolute reference. And I'm going to format those to be green, left-clicking OK, and left-clicking OK. So when I put a value in here, all the cells that are containing the conditional formatting rule with that formula are being evaluated. So if it equals 1, or 5, or 4, the cells conditionally format accordingly. So there's a common thing that people like to do, and that is to make their output more readable in a schedule with a lot of numbers by formatting every other row with some kind of fill that's not too dark generally. There's a way to do this by using a series of functions. There's a row function, which you can see in cell I11, that requires no arguments. This is row 11, that's row 12, and it'll generate the number that's associated with the row that that function is on. There's another function called a mod function that will divide, in this case, the value that's in I11, because that's the reference cell, by 2 and round the remainder up. So we get rule 2 satisfied. We have a formula that produces a result that's either a 1 or a 0, which in Excel's understanding, that's true or false. So we can utilize this to build a formula that conditionally formats every other line. And this time I'm going to build my formula by typing it in. Equal mod, and again, referring to rule number 5, we want to build this formula in reference to the active cell, which is in the name box, which is L11. So I want to take the mod of the row for L11, and I want that to be relative, and I want that value to be divided by 2, and the mod will give me the remainder. So if this equals 1, then I'm going to have a fill color. Let's pick a light one, light green, left-clicking OK, and we get every other line that's formatted with that fill color. We can also build a formula to format lines based on the content that's contained within some field value on the row. So let's say I want to find all of the class sizes, and we can visually do this, but this came from a schedule that's actually about 6,000 lines long. But let's say I want to accentuate all the rows for stocks that have a class size of 10. And again, we're working from P13, that's the active cell. And in every case, I'll begin with an equal sign, where S13 equals 10, I want to format with a fill. I'll just pick a different light shade. And I get column P that's formatted. But what I really want is for the entire row to be formatted. So this time, I'll begin with an equal sign, of course. I want the value that's in S13, and since I want each one of the cells in this region to reference column S, I'm going to make S an absolute reference, and as we go down row by row, we want the next subsequent row to be evaluated for that particular row. So we're on cell P13, we're dealing with row 13, but when we go to row 14, I want it to shift to row 14, but I still want it to look in column S. So where that equals 10, we want to set up some formatting again. Okay. Now we have the entire row that's formatted. Because as we go down from cell to cell in this region, or over from cell to cell, the formula has S as an absolute reference. So when I'm here, this formula is looking at S. When I'm here, it's looking at S. And even when we're in column S, it's still looking at S. And then when we go down, the row reference is relative. So the formula that's driving the conditional formatting on this row is looking in S18 to determine what the value is, to then determine if this row should carry that formatting or not. And of course it shouldn't, because the value is 1, not 10. So using one more example, I'm going to input a 0 here because I want to find out when things went south in the economy and when the months for the job creation really took a dive. And I want to display that visually. So I'm going to set up a conditional formatting rule. It's driven by a formula, of course. And again, we're working from cell D35. That's the cell whose orientation we should be keeping in mind when we're building this formula. So equal D35, and I want that to be a relative reference because as the formula is applied across this whole region, I want it to analyze each one of those cells independent of the other cells. And I want to find out when the value in those cells is less than the value that's here, which currently is 0. And of course, that should be an absolute reference because I want the formula that's generating the conditional formatting to compare the value in each one of these cells against the same reference, which is the value that's in cell F33. So again, we're going to choose some formatting. This time I'll make it red, really stand out. And since we've not hard-coded the value that we're using to compare the values in the cells to, we again have a dynamic conditional reference. So if it's less than 200, if it's less than 500, in all of them except for one is less than 500, May 2010. So that's conditional formatting with formulas. We went over the rules, the 6 main rules that apply when you're trying to do this. We looked at building some formulas with an absolute reference, and we built some formulas with a relative reference. We used a compound formula to derive some formatting for every other row on the worksheet. And then we had a couple of examples where we generated some conditional formatting based on the content of the region that we were formatting.